Emily and I were eating breakfast when Lori walked into the kitchen, humming a pop tune I didn't know. She was wearing a pink velour tracksuit and carrying a gym bag with work clothes in it. "Do you have time for a snack?" I asked. Asked me. "No," she replied. "I'm already late for practice. I'll grab a snack when I get to the paper." "I'll see you tonight," she added, waving cheerfully. As she turned to leave, my gaze was caught by the glint on the juicy logo on her sweatpants. I smirked at Emily and shook my head. My daughter only rolled her eyes. As we got into the car to start the drive to the university, Emily reached over and turned off the news on the radio. "Daddy," she said, "you have to do something about Mom. It's embarrassing that she dresses like a teenager all the time." Shit, I thought to myself. What am I going to say to that? The truth was that often Lori's clothes would be more appropriate on a college student than a 40-year-old woman. But how do you tell your wife something like that? Lori had always looked younger than her years and made every effort to maintain her appearance. Frankly, that was part of her appeal to me, and I was proud of her for looking so young, even if I too was sometimes embarrassed by some of her clothing choices. Besides, it wasn't really about her clothes. It was about the relationship between Lori and Emily. When Emily was an infant, Lori was always hovering over her, spending time with her every chance she got. But as Emily grew older, their relationship began to change. By the time Emily moved on to high school, Lori often acted like she was Emily's sister instead of her mother. I knew that teenagers needed to pull away from their parents so they could form their own personality and individuality. But Lori didn't seem to notice this and continued to meddle in Emily's life. I was reminded of an incident when Emily was a junior in high school and a group of her girlfriends came over to our house. The group of teenagers were laughing and chatting about clothes and boys, and Lori was right in the middle of it. As I was checking papers in my office, Emily burst in on us and demanded, "Daddy, make Mom give me my friends back." Honestly, at times they were more like rival high school seniors than mother and daughter. I tried to convince Lori that her daughter needed space, but Lori couldn't or wouldn't understand the problem. "We're more like sisters," Lori replied, "and it's okay for sisters to fight sometimes." This attitude annoyed me. I felt that Lori was trying to deny the fact that she was aging by competing with her daughter. But I didn't want to undermine Lori's authority in front of my daughter, so I tried to avoid the issue for now, focusing on Lori's clothing choices. "Baby, your mom has worked very hard to keep herself in shape, and it's natural for her to be proud of what she's accomplished. You have to admit that not many women can fit into the kind of clothes she wears," I said soothingly. "I know, Daddy," Emily replied, "but I'm embarrassed that she wears the same clothes as my female classmates." "I understand, baby. I'll tell her something," I promised, but I knew that anything I said was unlikely to have an effect. Lori had always been stubborn. In fact, that was partly why we'd gotten married. We'd met in college. I was a teaching assistant pursuing a doctorate in history, and Lori Carlton was a student taking one of my courses. I liked her immediately, but I knew it was best not to make any signs of attention to a student, especially in my class. But she couldn't help but notice my frequent glances and the attention I paid her because she began to flirt with me more and more often. After almost every lecture, she would come up to me to ask me a question, flapping her eyes and often touching my arm or hand. In the lecture hall, she sat in the front row, her skirt pulled up high enough for me to see her gorgeous legs and sometimes a hint of lace. It seemed like she was trying to break my immunity. Nevertheless, I held out until the semester was over, and then I asked her out. The tension between us was building so much that by the time she returned to my tiny apartment after dinner, we were almost suffocating. Instead of burning out, over time our relationship grew into something more solid and inclusive. By the time she was ready to graduate, I realized she was the woman I wanted to build my life around. So when she brought me to Savannah to meet her parents, I intended to ask her father for permission to marry his daughter. When we arrived at Lori's home in Savannah, we were met at the door by Cecily, Lori's younger sister, who joyfully hugged Lori and greeted me. Cecily was an accidental child, born about 16 years after Lori. Perhaps as a result, Lori became a second mother and role model to her younger sister. But while Cecily's greeting was warm, her mother received me coolly, and her father was downright icy. All my attempts to get him on my side were flatly rejected. Rufus Carlton was a wealthy lawyer, prominent in Savannah society, and his daughter's plans did not include marriage to some leftist, starving intellectual. I tried to assure him that I considered myself politically independent and B. I had already managed to get my first teaching position at a university in Atlanta. Neither argument mattered in the slightest. Rufus had already charted a course for his daughter's life, centered on marriage to a suitable candidate from the local gentry. In his eyes, I was simply not good enough. I was angry at her father's high-minded rejection, but Lori was furious. That's when I realized how stubborn she was. Even though we had intended to spend a long weekend with her family, after a private conversation with her father, she jumped out of the house, grabbed her things, and demanded that we return to Atlanta immediately. Along the way, I learned a lot about her tumultuous relationship with her father. Lori may have been the oldest, but she acted more like a second child, constantly rebelling against the restrictions her father tried to set. They were like oil and water, except not only did they not mix, but they couldn't coexist next to each other. "I'll be damned if I'm going to let my father run my life," she said firmly. When we finally got back to my apartment, she grabbed me by the shoulders and asked me almost angrily, "Do you still want to marry me?" When I readily confirmed that I did, she said, "Okay, let's go." With those words, she dragged me back to the car and drove me to the Fulton County Clerk of Court's office, where we got our license and were married on the spot. Thank goodness there is no waiting period in Georgia. The result of Lori's defiance was that upon learning of her act, her father cut off all contact with his daughter. There was no contact for birthdays or Christmas. Not even the birth of a grandchild could melt the ice. What's more, the freeze extended to the rest of the Carlton family. Early on, Lori received a letter from her younger sister, but it consisted mainly of a request for Lori to ask her father for forgiveness. Lori did not do so. I tried several times over the years to repair the relationship because I felt that family was too important to write it off as some kind of hopeless debt. But my attempts were ignored. I had no doubt where Lori got her stubborn streak from. Immersed in my memories, I was surprised to realize that we had made it to campus and were headed toward the bookstore. I pulled a few strings and managed to get Emily a summer job there. When she opened the car door to get out, I grabbed her arm. "Hey, what time should I pick you up this afternoon?" She hesitated for a moment, then turned around to smile at me. "You don't have to pick me up, Daddy. I'll make my own way home." I tried not to frown, but I still felt my gut clench. I was morally certain that her boyfriend, Brandon Hilton, would drive her. It's natural for a father to have custody of his daughter, but my doubts about Brandon went beyond the usual paternal reservations. He was a third-year law student, and it bothered me that someone so senior was showing interest in a freshman. I knew that many upperclassmen pounced on new female students like wolves on newborn lambs. Similarly, I had seen many inexperienced girls, fresh out of high school and eager to experience independent living for the first time, have their hearts broken. But I believe that a law student should be looking for a woman closer to his age to start a life together, not pursuing a girl who is still in her teens. His interest made me extremely wary. But Emily was clearly crazy about him, and Lori, who'd once had a long conversation with Brandon when he'd come after Emily, had no qualms about it. So I swallowed my protest and just said, "Okay, babe, I'll see you at dinner tonight." From there, I headed to the history department, still having my doubts about my daughter. I had no illusions about her innocence. I was sure she'd been deflowered by the little creep she'd dated during her last 2 years of high school. But Lori and I had had some frank discussions with her, and Lori had quietly arranged for Emily to be on the pill, so at least she was protected in that regard. Still, I wished Brandon Hilton would just disappear and let my daughter find someone closer in age. Sighing, I made my way to my tiny office and started going through the administrative minutiae that colleges require even for summer sessions. But this chore couldn't contain my enthusiasm as I began to think about the course I would be teaching. I managed to convince the head of the history department to let me teach an elective on the same topic on which I had written my doctoral dissertation, vigilantism. My hypothesis was that vigilantes played a more significant role in history than is commonly believed, and that they presented a complex moral dilemma for society. For example, American lore is full of stories of vigilantes who are forced to seek justice alone. We Americans tend to sympathize with such figures and find them appealing. To illustrate this, I plan to show the class excerpts from Death Wish, a movie starring Charles Bronson about an architect who is forced to become a vigilante after his wife is murdered because the police cannot find the perpetrators. To counterbalance this, I also assigned the class to read The Oxbow Incident, a classic Western by Walter Van Tilburg Clark that tells of a posse that apprehends several cattle thieves but learns that their captors are innocent. The first class went well. The students seemed to understand the moral and social dilemma, and I know they appreciated watching violent movies. The story doesn't have to be boring. So when I got home after lunch, I was in a good mood, and it stayed that way until the front door slammed, and I heard Emily running to her room in tears. The door to her room was closed, but I could hear her crying inside. I knocked. "Can I come in, Emily?" "Okay, Daddy," I heard her mumble, turned the knob, and entered. Our daughter was lying face down on the bed, her back rising and falling with sobs. I sat down beside her and pulled her to me. She didn't resist. In fact, she clung to me as she had when she was a little girl with a scraped knee. Her tears wet the front of my shirt. I ached for her obvious pain, but some part of me was glad she still needed her daddy. "What happened, baby girl?" I asked, lifting her chin so I could see her face. "Brandon left me," she managed to mumble before her crying resumed. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry," I told her, but I wasn't being completely honest. If Brandon Hilton was out of her life, that was fine with me. However, I knew I couldn't tell her that, so I just hugged her and stroked her back, trying to comfort her while she cried. After a while, I heard Lori walk in and hoped that a little feminine perspective might help. Leaving Emily in her room, I hurried downstairs to consult with my wife. "We had a bit of a tragedy today," I explained to her. "Brandon dumped Emily and now she's inconsolable." "Good," Lori replied. "About time." I was taken aback. I'd expected a little more motherly sympathy. "But I thought you liked Brandon," I replied. "He wasn't right for her," Lori replied sharply. "Don't you have something to say to her?" I asked uncertainly. "Right now, it's best to leave Emily alone. She'll get over it soon enough. Girls that age do that." I was surprised. I thought Lori would be caring and sympathetic, and it turned out that role was mine to play. Once again, I mentally shook my head at the enigma of the mother-daughter relationship. "I hope you're right," I said, and left the matter at that. My doubts only increased when Emily never came down for dinner that night. She had some breakfast the next morning, but immediately felt nauseous and went back to bed. I informed the bookstore manager that she was sick and hoped Lori's assessment was accurate. Emily went to work the next day, but still hadn't eaten much. She'd given up on the idea of breakfast altogether. I started to wonder if she'd gotten some kind of stomach flu, but she said she was fine, so I let it go. It was clear to me that she was still deeply upset about the sudden breakup with Brandon, but Lori seemed to be right. She was feeling a little better. That assessment only lasted until Friday. I stayed at the office late that day, trying to get some extra stuff done so I wouldn't have to work over the weekend. As a result, I got home at almost 6 p.m. Setting my laptop aside in the study, I went in search of Lori and Emily. The door to Emily's room was closed, and I heard crying coming from inside again. I knocked gently, and when I opened the door, I found Emily in tears on the bed. When she looked up at me, there was sadness mixed with fear on her face, and for a second I thought she was going to run away. But then her shoulders slumped, and she suddenly threw herself into my arms, crying even harder. Baby, what's wrong?" I begged. "What happened?" She held her face buried in my shoulder for another minute, and then she looked up at me with an anguished expression. "Oh, Daddy," she sobbed, "I'm pregnant." I felt slightly dizzy, turned around and sank down next to her on the bed. I was so shocked and dazed I could barely think straight, and I heard myself ask two of the stupidest questions of my life. "Are you sure?" sighed I. Then, realizing how stupid that question was, I added, "How did this happen?" Thankfully, Emily was so upset that she simply answered my nonsensical questions. "I took one of those home pregnancy tests yesterday and it came back positive. So today I went to the student health center, Daddy. The doctor said I'm about 6 weeks pregnant." "But you've been on the pill," I protested. "You can't be pregnant." "I know," she sobbed. "I told the doctor that. But she said the pill doesn't work 100% of the time and that I must be one of the lucky 1%. I pulled her against me, and at that moment I think we both wished she was still a little girl, and this was all a bad dream. We sat like that for quite a while, not talking, just holding each other. Finally, I loosened my grip so I could look at her again. "What's your mom going to say about this?" I asked. "She doesn't know yet, Daddy. Mommy hasn't come home yet." I was annoyed with Lori. Of all the days to be late, This was the one when I really needed her advice and perspective. But I pushed the irritation to the back of my mind because I knew my daughter needed me. I glanced at the clock on her nightstand and saw that it was 7 o'clock. It's getting late. Let's go downstairs and see if we can get something to eat, I said to Emily. We walked to the kitchen together and found some leftovers in the refrigerator that we could heat up. After we ate for a while, I asked her, "Have you talked to Brandon about this?" Her face darkened again. "I tried to call him today, but his number was disconnected. His landlord said he was out of town and didn't leave a forwarding address." About what I expected, I thought unpleasantly, but I didn't say anything out loud because I didn't want to upset Emily any further. So I asked the question that had been weighing on me the most since I'd learned of her condition. "Have you thought about what you want to do next?" I deliberately phrased the question ambiguously, but Emily understood exactly what I was asking. "Oh, Daddy, I don't know what I want to do. I'm not ready to be a mother, and having a baby would really mess up my college education. But I just don't think I can get it over with." More tears streamed down her cheeks. Though her next words were soft, they were decisive. "Daddy, I think I want to have a baby." I walked around the table and hugged her. "If that's what you decide, honey, Mommy and I will support you in any way we can. We'll get through this." Emily looked up at me. "I love you, Daddy," was all she said, but it was enough. I sat back down and we finished dinner. Another glance at the clock showed it was past 8. Where on earth was Lori? I tried calling her cell phone, but it must have been turned off because my call went straight to voicemail. Then I tried calling her office at the newspaper, but there was no answer there either. Finally, I decided to call Jackie, her best friend. But when I reached her, Jackie said she hadn't talked to Lori in days and didn't know anything about Lori's plans for the evening. When I hung up, Emily looked at me with concern. "Is everything okay with Mom?" she asked. "She probably has some kind of meeting or interview tonight." "She probably told me about it and I forgot," I reassured Emily. In fact, I was pretty sure there was nothing on Lori's calendar that would cause her to be late today, and I was starting to worry. But I didn't want to worry Emily. She had enough to worry about already, so she and I went into the room and turned on the TV. One of those talent search programs was on, and she and I passed the time by making snide remarks about the performances and the judges. By the time the program was over, Emily was half asleep and I advised her to head to bed. "You've had a pretty rough day," I told her, "and you could probably use some sleep. I'll let your mom know what's going on when she gets home and we can talk about it tomorrow." Emily left for her room and I was left waiting for Lori. Where was that woman? I was awakened by the sun streaming through the windows of the room, and I shuddered at the realization that I had fallen asleep on the couch. I quickly got up and checked our bedroom, but Lori wasn't there. I checked the garage just in case, but her car was still gone. Now I was really worried. I called her cell phone again, but got nothing. There was no answer at her office either. After much searching, I found the home number of her supervisor from the newspaper. His answer was even more disturbing. Lori had come to the office on Friday, but left mid-afternoon saying she had a meeting. And she still hasn't returned. I'd never had to look for a missing person before, and I had absolutely no idea what to do. Increasingly worried, I started calling local hospitals to see if any patients matching her description had been admitted. To no avail. Finally, in desperation, I called the police. It took several redirects, but I finally spoke to a sergeant who told me that they had no reports of accidents or unidentified victims of criminal gambling that fit Lori's description. "Okay," I said. "How do I file a missing persons report?" "You can't," the sergeant told me, "unless the person has been missing for at least 72 hours. When I started to protest, he interrupted me. "Look, the most likely scenario is that something happened unexpectedly and your wife didn't have time to tell you about it. We can't mobilize the entire police force every time one spouse forgets to inform the other of their plans. The fact that her car is also missing makes this scenario very likely. But if your wife doesn't show up, I've already recorded your call, so the clock is ticking down to 72 hours. And if you can give me the make, model, and license plate number, I'll have our guys keep an eye on her car just in case." I gave the sergeant the information and thanked him for his time. I couldn't believe that Lori could go anywhere without at least calling to let me know her whereabouts, but I couldn't think of anything else I could do to help find her. The only thing left for me to do was try my best to make sure Emily didn't get too upset. I spent the rest of the day calling everyone I could think of to see if anyone knew where Lori had gone. No one could offer any leads. I even considered calling Savannah, but given our history, I couldn't imagine Lori going there. All weekend, I felt like Emily and I were in prison because we were afraid to leave the house for fear that Lori would come home and we would miss her. We felt cut off from the rest of the world. The phone rang a few times, but each time it was only a concerned friend hoping for good news. Loneliness, anxiety, and depression were our only companions. On Monday, Emily was still plagued by morning sickness, but she discovered that if she didn't eat or inhale the odor of breakfast being prepared, the worst effects could be avoided. Accordingly, I switched to cold cereal, although I still made coffee. I persuaded Emily to go to work at the bookstore, if only to take her mind off her mother for a little while. She finally agreed. I dropped her off but went back home to wait. I didn't have a lecture until 1 p.m. Around 10 a.m. the phone rang, and to my surprise, it was the same police sergeant I had spoken to on Saturday. "Mr. Manning, have you heard from your wife yet?" he inquired. I informed him that I had not. "Very well. It has been 72 hours, so we are going to activate your missing persons report. Can you come down to the station and help us fill out the forms?" "Sure," I told him. "I'll be right down." When I arrived at the police station, the detective from the missing persons unit took me to his desk. I thought I had given the sergeant all the information he needed, but the detective wanted a lot more details. After almost an hour of questions, I thought we were done, but I was wrong. The detective looked at me carelessly and said, "By the way, I believe we found your wife's car." "What?" said I, flabbergasted. "Where is she?" "Actually, it was on the top floor of the parking garage near the campus where you teach," he said. He paused to let me digest what he'd said, then continued. "Are you sure you didn't see your wife on Friday?" "No," I answered without hesitation, "not since we had breakfast that morning." "Very well, Mr. Manning, that will be all for today." I felt a little defensive. "May I have my wife's car keys?" The detective shook his head. "Oh no, forensics are checking it for evidence. Fingerprints, bloodstains, and the like." That shook me badly. Could something terrible have happened to Lori? The next few days were horrible. I was haunted by the thought that Lori had been kidnapped and molested, or worse. I remembered how annoyed I was when she didn't come home that night, and I felt ashamed of my unkind thoughts. At the same time, I tried my best to calm Emily down. Her nerves were already on edge because of the pregnancy, and losing her mother had driven her almost to hysterics. Added to the fear for her mother's safety was the paranoia for her own safety and the safety of her unborn child. Lori's disappearance shook us both to the core. And then it got worse. A missing persons detective called me and asked me to come down to the station. When I arrived, I was ushered into a small room where another detective was waiting. The first detective introduced her as a homicide officer. When I heard this, I thought I was going to faint. I collapsed into a wooden chair and managed to whisper, "Did you find Lori?" "Is she—" "No," said the female detective. "We haven't found her, but we were able to find out some important information. We checked the airlines and bus companies. None of them have any record of a woman matching your wife's description traveling that Friday or Saturday. We checked your bank, and nothing was withdrawn from your joint checking or savings accounts. We checked the credit card company, and there were no withdrawals from her account. So we don't have any answers yet, Mr. Manning, but we do have a number of questions for you." I was stunned. "Me? Why? I've told you everything I know about Lori's disappearance." She looked at me coldly. "Your wife was last seen leaving the newspaper office in her car, which we later found in the university parking lot." "We went through her entire car, Mr. Manning. The only fingerprints we found other than hers were yours. How do you explain that?" I was dumbfounded. What's there to explain? I rode in her car and even drove it a few times. Of course my fingerprints are there. How good was your relationship with your wife, Mr. Manning? Were there no fights over money, infidelity, anything like that?" she asked. Suddenly, everything fell into place. "Are you asking me if I had anything to do with my wife's disappearance?" "I can't believe it. After all, I'm the one who reported her missing." The detective crossed her arms. "It's not uncommon in cases like this," she said calmly. "In a case like this?" sighed I. "Are you accusing me of a crime? Do I need a lawyer?" She cast a quick glance at her partner. "If you think you need a lawyer, Mr. Manning, you can certainly get one." "But I haven't done anything," I shouted. "My wife is out there somewhere, in danger. You ought to be looking for her, not pestering me with silly questions and innuendos. Calm down, Mr. Manning, said the first detective. We're just trying to find possible motives for your wife's sudden disappearance. You're the most logical person to start with, wouldn't you agree? Don't you want to help us find her? Still frustrated, I sat back in my chair. Of course I do, I replied sharply. Okay, what do you want to know? Were there any problems between you and your wife, Mr. Manning? No, I answered confidently. None at all? She asked. Not a single disagreement? Well, nothing serious, I said. What are some minor problems? She pressed. We've had the same arguments as any couple married for 20 years, I said. You know, like disagreements about how to raise our daughter. She leaned across the table to me. Has there been any disagreements about your daughter recently, Mr. Manning? Any events or new situations involving her? I slumped back in my chair. Unmarried motherhood was not the shameful event it once was. Still, I was uncomfortable talking about it. Yes, one situation, Detective. My daughter is pregnant. The two exchanged glances. The man spoke quickly. And what was Mrs. Manning's reaction when she learned of your daughter's condition? Before I could answer, the woman entered the conversation. Maybe that's what made her run away? Maybe she was upset by the news? Did you argue with your wife about what happened? Did you do something to her in the heat of the argument? I jumped to my feet and leaned across the table toward the woman with anger. The male detective quickly grabbed my arm and sat me back in my chair. Calm down, Mr. Manning, calm down. He threw the woman an angry look. My partner got a little carried away. We're just trying to explore all the possibilities. I took a deep breath and tried to relax, but the detective wouldn't let go of my hand. I kept my eyes on the woman who was stepping back nervously. The only person I love more than my wife is my daughter, and I would die trying to protect either of them. For that matter, Lori didn't even know about our daughter. The night I found out about my daughter's condition, Lori didn't come home. I looked over my shoulder at the detective standing behind me. I've had enough of these insinuations to last me a day. Unless you're going to accuse me of a crime I didn't commit, I'm out of here. It's okay, Mr. Manning, the detective said behind my back, loosening his grip and pointing me toward the door. We don't have anything else for you at the moment. He swung the door open in front of me. However, we may need to ask you more questions later. I started to walk out the door, but he stopped me. One last thing, Mr. Manning. Don't plan on leaving town anytime soon. I gave him a glare and walked out. The door closed behind me and I heard angry voices. As I drove home, I was so angry I was shaking. But as my adrenaline levels started to drop, I began to rationalize what had happened. Of course they have to check all the possibilities, I told myself. But that didn't make me feel any better. I was doing nothing but trying to find my missing wife. I couldn't even think about the accusation that I might have hurt Lori without my blood pressure rising. Why would she even think that? I angrily growled. Of course, when I got home, Emily wanted to know what I'd learned from the police. I didn't want to upset her further, so I just told her that they didn't have any new information, but they just wanted to double-check some details. Afterward, I bitterly thought, now I'm starting to lie to my own daughter. What the hell? The next day brought a new humiliation. The police came to our house with a search warrant. I had to sit on the deck for 2 hours while they went through the house, looking in every nook, cranny, and cranny. I don't know exactly what they were looking for, but whatever it was, they didn't find it. I used the time to call my lawyer. It looked like I was definitely going to need one. But just as the police were about to leave, a tow truck pulled up to our driveway and took my car away. They promised I could have it back in a couple of days, but since they still had Lori's car, I had to have a neighbor drive me to the rental place so I could have transportation. The only blessing was that Emily wasn't around during this ordeal. But neither she nor I were able to avoid what happened next. 2 days later, I opened the local news section of our newspaper and found the following headline. Husband is person of interest in local woman's disappearance. The article recounted Lori's disappearance again and added information about the search warrant and checks made on my car. The article never said it in so many words, but it clearly implied that foul play was likely and that the husband, me, was the most likely suspect. Emily cried after reading the article, and I called my lawyer in a rage. Is there nothing I can do to stop this? They've practically tried and convicted me already. and they don't even know if a crime was committed. I want to sue for defamation. My lawyer did his best to calm me down. John, I've already looked into the matter. At a guess, the police may have planted this story to try to pressure you. But you'll never be able to prove it because reporters aren't required to reveal their sources. As for libel, there are no factual inaccuracies in the story. It is just the way they are presented that is so defamatory. Remember, Lori has a lot of friends at the paper. You'll just have to be patient until it resolves itself. Bitch! I swore helplessly to myself. When I walked into my office at the university that afternoon, I found a note on the door asking the chairman of the history department to admit me. As soon as I reached Henry Vance's office, his secretary immediately ushered me inside. He got straight to the point. John, in light of the whole Lori thing, we think it would be best if someone else took over your summer session until this matter is settled. Henry, I said, it's Lori who's missing, not me. Of course, it's very hard for me right now, but there's no reason why I can't continue the course. Of course, he said. Of course, but with that cloud over you, if you continue teaching, it will look bad for the department and bad for the university. You understand, don't you? I jumped to my feet. Oh, I understand, all right. I understand that you want me to disappear, even though no charges have been brought against me, and there is no evidence that a crime was ever committed. Henry, you're a professor of American history, for God's sake. Don't you realize that a man is presumed innocent until proven guilty? He obviously did not expect me to object and was dumbfounded. I felt I had the upper hand and continued. Isn't it ironic that I'm teaching a course on the role of vigilantes in history, and you're ready to stage an old-fashioned lynching? Good God, John, that's not it, he hissed. Not that? Well, tell me, I continued, is the rector willing to support you if I refuse to go? Have you checked with the faculty senate to see what they think? Because unless you have checked, and unless you have been given direct authority to suspend me, I will return to this lecture hall this afternoon and give my course. And if you try to stop me, I promise I'll make such a fuss that you'll be the one asked to resign. He sat down abruptly in his chair and I leaned back against his desk. I love this university and I will never do anything to damage its reputation. That includes me not succumbing to some misguided notion of frontier justice from a man who is not authorized to act and doesn't know the facts. With these words, I turned and walked out of his office. I wondered if anyone from security was waiting for me as I went to the lecture hall for class, but the only people who showed up there were my students. Interestingly, attendance was perfect. I guess it helps to have a famous lecturer, I thought wryly. I had planned to give a lecture on the comparison between vigilantes and terrorists, but I decided to skip that discussion and tell them about myself. I assumed that everyone in the class knew about my situation, and I thought that what was happening to me might be instructive. So I began the discussion by recounting the events of the past 2 days, including news about me and my meeting with the chair of the history department. I began by reading a newspaper article about Lori's disappearance. And here's a question for you. Can the media ever become vigilantes? Is there a line between factual reporting and provocation? When I was challenged, I asked them to recall the role William Randolph Hearst and his network of newspapers played in inciting the Spanish-American War. Hearst didn't fire a single shot, but most historians cite him as the spark that ignited the conflict, I told them. What about Chairman Vance from the history department? I asked. Asked me. Did he act in good faith as a responsible defender of the university's reputation, or as a vigilant who decided to act on his own, without evidence and without authority? We had a great discussion, and most of the students didn't want to stop when the class ended. I didn't like what was happening to me, but at least I was able to use it to make the course content more understandable to my students. It was a teachable moment, as they say. Although I didn't hear anything more from the university administration, the article in the newspaper did have an effect. When the first news of Lori's disappearance appeared in the paper, Emily and I received a flood of calls from friends and neighbors with condolences and suggestions and just words of encouragement. After a while, there were so many that I wanted to leave the calls on my answering machine. I felt helpless and frustrated because I couldn't say anything to the callers. Of course, I couldn't do that because I was still hoping to hear from Lori. But after the second article came out, the number of calls dropped to almost zero. It was like we were quarantined with some kind of infectious disease. Now our friends wanted nothing to do with us. It seemed as if I was a victim of what had befallen Lori. Because we were so isolated, I was caught off guard when the phone rang one evening a few days later. It was calling someone I was in no way expecting to hear from. My father-in-law, Rufus Carlton. "You bastard," he shouted as soon as I spoke into the receiver. "What have you done to my daughter?" I took a deep breath and decided to try to be polite. "Good evening to you too, Rufus. To answer your question, I will say that none of us know what happened to Lori, and we're doing everything we can to find her." "Don't give me that nonsense," he muttered back. "When a wife goes missing, it's always the husband's fault. I knew you were nothing but trouble from the moment I met you, but Lori wouldn't listen to me and turned her back on her family because of you." "But she's still my daughter, damn it, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. I've got people working on this, and we're going to string you up and snap your neck before this is over. Do you hear me?" I couldn't contain my anger any longer. "I hear you just fine, Rufus. And you know what? You didn't know me when I was courting Lori, and you sure as hell don't know me now. As for Lori, all I can say is that you have a funny way of showing your love for your daughter by cutting her off without a word for 20 years. If we don't hear from you for another 20 years, it will be too soon for me." With those words, I slammed the receiver down, hoping his eardrum would burst in the process. Then I sank into my chair, shaking with anger. I was tired of being tried and convicted in absentia for things I hadn't done. Meanwhile, my wife was missing and I missed her terribly. Worse, I knew that with each passing day our chances of finding her again were diminishing. It was enough to drive a man insane. Fortunately, one thing that helped me keep my sanity came from an unlikely source: my daughter. A few days after Rufus's call, she came to me with a request. "Daddy, I want to take a Lamaze class to learn more about the birthing process. But I really need a partner, and I don't have anyone who can do it. Will you come with me, Daddy?" Of course I said yes, and a few nights later we found ourselves in a conference room at a local hospital. There were about a dozen couples with us, and the women were in various stages of pregnancy. A couple of them looked so far along that I got nervous. Suddenly something was going to happen that night. An attractive red-haired woman, who was a few years younger than me, came up to greet us. "Hi, welcome to the Lamaze class. I'm Bridget Murphy, and I'll be teaching the class." As I regarded her, Emily introduced herself to Bridget, who spoke to her briefly, and then suggested that Emily meet the other moms-to-be before the class began. She then turned to me with a smile and said, "And you are?" I wasn't paying attention and mumbled, "Oh, I'm John Manning. I'm the father." Bridget's smile immediately turned into an unfriendly frown and I blushed, realizing what she was thinking. No, I said hastily. "I mean that I'm Emily's father, not the baby's father." Her face relaxed. "In that case, welcome to class. I apologize for jumping to conclusions, but I've seen worse things in the maternity ward. So where is the baby's father?" I frowned. "Unfortunately, he's gone to an unknown destination, so I'll be Emily's partner in all of this." Bridget smiled warmly at me. "I'm sorry to hear about your father. Unfortunately, that happens a lot these days. But I think it's wonderful that you want to be there for your daughter. Not every father would agree to help." I looked around and saw Emily chatting eagerly with the other moms-to-be, so I decided to speak frankly to Bridget about our situation. I was uncomfortable with what I had to say, but I wanted to lay all my cards on the table so there wouldn't be any awkward moments later. "Before we start, Bridget, there's something you should know about me. I don't know if you've read about it in the papers, but I'm the John Manning whose wife disappeared. I had nothing to do with it, but if you saw the report on the news, you might think otherwise. In any case, if you're uncomfortable with my presence, I'll try to make other arrangements." She looked at me calculatingly, then smiled weakly. "You're here for your daughter. That's all that matters to me. Besides, in my experience, cold-blooded killers rarely attend Lamaze classes. Now we need to start the session." I had taken a Lamaze class with Lori before Emily was born, but I must admit that I had forgotten most of what I had learned. Nevertheless, I tried to be supportive and Emily really enjoyed the first session. She seemed to hit it off with Bridget right from the start, which helped a lot. Getting out of the house and, more importantly, out of my head to focus on Emily was a real blessing for me. The stress of worrying about Lori on the one hand, and anger at those who thought I was responsible for her disappearance on the other, was worse than anything I'd experienced in my life. Being able to forget about it all, even if only for an hour or so a week, proved to be a lifesaver. Although the calls from friends and neighbors stopped as soon as suspicion fell on me, it wasn't the end of all outside contact. I was stunned the first time I picked up the phone, and a man I didn't know began spewing invective at me for killing my wife. After that, Every now and then I found hate mail from anonymous writers condemning me to perdition for what they said I had done to Lori. There were even those who reported that they knew how I had done it and where the body was buried. If that wasn't enough, I even received an offer of money from one of the supermarket tabloids if I would confess to their reporter. As a result, I almost threw away a handwritten letter with no return address that I found in the mailbox one afternoon. But I did open it, and when I started to read it, I almost fell over. "John, I just saw a report about you in the local paper." "I'm so sorry. I never thought anyone could think anything had happened to me, much less that you might have done something terrible. Please tell the police that I am alive and well and living with the man I love. File for divorce if you haven't already. I'm not coming back. Don't try to find me. It was what I had to do. Please tell Emily that I still love her despite what I did to her. Lori." At that moment, Emily came into the room, and when she saw my face, she cried, "Daddy, what happened?" I held out a letter to her. "It's from your mom." She shrieked slightly and took the letter from me with trembling hands. When she read it, she began to cry pitifully and collapsed in my arms. "How could she do that, Daddy? How could she leave us like that? She didn't even say goodbye." As I held Emily in my arms, I was reminded of an incident when she was very young and wandered into the backyard. We almost freaked out when we couldn't find her and were ready to go to the authorities when a neighbor brought her to us. I distinctly remember the conflicting emotions: relief that she was safe and anger at her for scaring us half to death. Now I felt the same mix of emotions: relief that our long nightmare was over, and rage at Lori's selfish betrayal of her family. Emily was the first to come to her senses. "Daddy, we need to take this letter to the police immediately." Of course, I realized she was right and went to get my wallet and keys. When I got back to the den, she was just coming out of her room. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly, and I wasn't going to argue with her. We were together. As we drove to the station, Emily nervously rubbed the letter she had received in her hands. She looked at me with concern on her face. "Are you going to divorce Mom, Dad?" I sensed that Emily was in a fragile state, and I didn't want to upset her further, so I simply said, "Well, I need to talk to a lawyer and see what he says." But she interrupted me. "I really think you should, Daddy." "I really think so." I hated to see the rift between Emily and her mother, but Lori had brought it all on herself. She'd left Emily just as she'd left me for another man. Emily was old enough to realize that and accept reality, no matter how painful it was. She reached for me, and we held each other's hand the rest of the way to the police station. I hadn't even thought to call ahead, but luckily we caught the detective on duty, the one we dealt with in the missing persons department. When he took us to his desk, I asked him, "Where's your partner from homicide?" With some reluctance, he went to get her. Ever since we ran into each other at the station, she had been absent whenever the cops talked to me. When she arrived, I took the letter from Emily and tossed it on the table in front of them. "This came in the mail today," I said curtly. The male detective opened the envelope and quickly read the letter. He glanced at me and silently handed it to the woman. When she finished, she looked at me. "You could have written it yourself, you know." I felt anger rising in me, but restrained myself. Of course I could have. "And I could have flown to New York to mail it to myself, or didn't you notice the postmark?" She started to answer, but to my surprise, Emily interrupted her. "And before you accuse my father of forgery, I brought along an old letter my mother wrote me when I went away to camp. You can see it's her handwriting." The first detective took Emily's old letter and put it next to the new one. His partner looked over his shoulder. They looked at each other, and then the first detective looked at me again. "We'll have to take this to the lab for confirmation, but I think the missing person case is solved." He held out his hand. "I apologize for all this suspicion," he said, "but we had to check." I reluctantly shook it. But when the female detective extended her hand, I turned away, and Emily and I walked out. I guess I'd been naive. I expected there to be some official notification that the case was closed, but there was nothing like that. Yes, I was no longer a suspect since there was no crime, but my reputation was tarnished, and I had no absolution for my non-existent sin. I had to have my lawyer call the newspaper and make veiled threats before they agreed to publish the news. And when they did, all I got was a couple paragraphs at the bottom of the last page of the local news with the headline: "The case of the missing wife is the case of the runaway spouse." I was practically front-page news when everyone thought I was done with her, I protested to my attorney. "Now that I've been acquitted, all I've gotten is a few lines. Is that fair?" He shook his head. Unfortunately, that's the way it goes, John. Mysterious disappearances and possible murders are news. The everyday truth doesn't sell in the papers. I'm sorry, but that's all you're going to get. I gritted my teeth but realized there was nothing I could do to change the situation. In desperation, I made a photocopy of the short story and sent copies to everyone I cared about. I planted a copy on Henry Nance's desk, and he at least had the courtesy to make an embarrassed face and mutter congratulations. I even laminated a copy of the article and stuck it in my wallet so I could pull it out and show it to people when it came up. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people chose fiction over a true story. One thing I didn't do was send a copy to Rufus Carlton. Let his highly paid detectives find out what his daughter has done, I thought to myself. All of this had one positive result. After the police confirmed the authenticity of the letter, I easily filed for a divorce on grounds of desertion and quickly obtained an absentee judgment. This resolved any potential legal issues and allowed me to be single again. Soon, I hoped, I could begin to move on with my life. Throughout this process, I continued to take Lamaze classes with Emily at Bridget Murphy's. Emily became close to Bridget, and several times the three of us would go out for coffee after class. Bridget's story was a sad one. She married her college sweetheart right after graduation and before he was deployed to Afghanistan to fulfill his ROTC obligations. She became pregnant while he was on leave, but he was killed in an IED explosion before she learned the happy news. Shortly afterward, Bridget had a miscarriage and lost the baby. She also lost the opportunity to have more children. Such terrible circumstances would have stunned many people, but instead of giving in to despair, Bridget somehow found the strength to dedicate herself to helping others. She enrolled in nursing school and specialized in midwifery so she could help other women give birth. One manifestation of her dedication was the Lamaze classes she taught. I was amazed at her resilience and amazed at her ability to work with young moms. I once told her, "As a professional educator, I must say I'm impressed with your ability to teach these women skills that don't come naturally. You have a real gift." She blushed and said it was only because her class was so motivated, but I knew it took more than motivation to get a good education. Emily and I were driving home from class one evening when she surprised me with a question. "Did you notice what Bridget is wearing today?" she asked. I couldn't tell Emily what outfit Bridget was wearing, but I did notice that she had changed out of her nurse's uniform into her regular clothes. "And she was also wearing makeup, Daddy." "Oh," I said dejectedly. "Well, that's nice." "Don't you see, Daddy? She's dressing up for you," Emily said in frustration. "Why would she do that?" I asked, not understanding. Emily shook her head, marveling at my stupidity. "Because, Daddy, she likes you. I think you should ask her out. It's high time you got back in the game. After my divorce became final, I started thinking about dating again, but I didn't do anything about it. After all of our friends were married, and I didn't know any single women. Sure, the campus was full of them, but they were mostly all Emily's age. There were a lot of reasons I didn't want anything like that. But Emily kept me on my toes, and at the end of the next class, I nervously approached Bridget and asked if she wanted to go out sometime. "You mean for coffee?" she asked with a twinkle in her eye. "No, I mean maybe dinner and a movie," I replied awkwardly. "With Emily?" she asked, and I could swear I saw a hint of a smirk at the corner of her mouth. "No," I stammered. "Maybe just you and me." "That is, if you don't want Emily to come. That would be fine too." Now she was definitely enjoying my discomfort. "No, just you and me, John." And so I started dating again. I was very apprehensive about rekindling the relationship. Not only had I been out of the game for 20 years, but my courtship with Lori had been filled with drama and wild swings of emotion. I was sure I couldn't go through that again. Bridget dispelled all my fears. She was extremely calm and centered emotionally. She really disliked games, and she was confident enough to not need constant stroking of her ego. In short, she was the anti-Lori, and that helped me get over the pain and resentment I felt about Lori leaving me. With Bridget, I was able to relax and be myself. I wasn't going to rush things, but truth be told, I was beginning to see how I was going to build a life together with her. Emily's baby was due around the 1st of March, and her pregnancy was going very well. Even the morning sickness disappeared after the first month. So I didn't regret taking a day trip to our campus in Columbus the day before Valentine's Day. It was only a 2-hour drive, and before I hit the road, I reminded Emily to call me on my cell phone if anything happened. The ride was pleasant, and I was able to conduct my business without incident. We had a late lunch, and before hitting the road back, I decided to check my phone for messages. To my dismay, the battery was dead and I hadn't noticed. I quickly grabbed my phone on campus to call my daughter, but there was no answer. This alarmed me, so I called Bridget to ask her to check on Emily and make sure everything was okay. When I reached her, Bridget's voice was nothing like her usual calm tone. "Thank God you called," she said. "Emily's water broke right after you left. She's in heavy labor at the hospital right now. Don't take any chances, but you need to get back here as soon as possible." Panicked, I jumped in the car and sped toward Atlanta. Usually the I-85 freeway is jammed with highway patrol cars because of Fort Benning, but I somehow managed to avoid the radar traps and made it to the hospital in only 90 minutes. When the elevator let me out into the maternity ward, the nurses quickly dressed me, but instead of leading me to the delivery room, they took me to a semi-detached room. As I entered the room, all I saw was my daughter lying in bed holding my own daughter, my granddaughter. My heart simultaneously clenched at the fact that I had missed the birth, and I was happy that mom and baby were okay. When my field of vision widened a little, I realized Bridget was standing by Emily's bedside with a wide smile on her face, cooing over the new life Emily was holding in her arms. Seeing me, Bridget smiled widely and began to step aside. "Now I'll let you be alone with Emily and her baby," she said, but Emily grabbed her arm. "Please don't go," Emily pleaded. She looked up at me. "Daddy, when I couldn't reach you, I called Bridget. She came to get me, brought me to the hospital, and coached me the whole way." All I could do was look at Bridget with sincere gratitude. I didn't have the words to express my appreciation. Emily looked at me, at Bridget, and smiled happily. "I've decided what I'm going to name my baby, Bridget Valentine Manning." She turned to Bridget. "If that's okay with you, of course." Bridget smiled through her tears. "If that's what you want, I'd be honored." Emily turned to me again. "Daddy, would you like to hold your granddaughter?" It had been a long time since I'd held a newborn in my arms, and this baby seemed much smaller than Emily had when she came into the world. But when I looked at baby Bridget's tiny red face, I was overcome with intense emotion and vowed to protect and support her as best I could. The circumstances under which she came into this world suddenly became far less important than the fact that she was here now and needed her family. Nature intended for people to have children while they are young for a reason. Over the next few weeks, I thought of this as I felt myself growing tired. Even though Emily was head over heels in her work, she still needed a lot of help. Newborns require around-the-clock attention, and more than once I came to class having barely slept the night before. Emily was holding up well and not complaining, but I could see that she was just as exhausted. In addition to playing with baby Bridget and changing her diapers, Emily had to breastfeed her. Bridget reminded me of how much energy it takes out of a mother. It was hectic, but we managed, and as the baby grew, we began to get into a routine, albeit a very different one. Once again, Bridget proved to be a lifesaver. She quickly enrolled Emily in parenting classes where she socialized with other parents of newborns. By the second month, Emily was already taking her new daughter to classes and was excited to get out of the house. One day, as Emily was leaving for one of these classes, I heard the front doorbell ring. This was not unusual. Emily was having a hard time handling the door with a baby in her arms. So when I opened the door, I smiled, but was stunned when I saw who was standing on the doorstep. It was Lori. Ever since I received Lori's letter and learned of her act, I had thought many times about what I would say to her if I ever saw her again. I longed for the opportunity to vent my rage, call her names, and demand answers to all the questions she left behind. But when I did, I was stunned. I hadn't expected to see her again, and now that she was here, I was at a loss for words. All I could do was stand there and stare at her. "Hello, John," she said warily. "Can I come in?" As if on autopilot, I backed away from the door and she came in and sat on the couch as if nothing had changed between us. I couldn't help but study her. She was still an attractive woman. But she also seemed older, with wrinkles under her eyes and a few lines on her face that I didn't remember. Her hair looked like she didn't pay much attention to it, which wasn't like her. At least her clothes were age-appropriate, I thought, remembering how she'd annoyed Emily with her overly youthful closet. "You really have a lot of nerve to show up here," I said finally. "Believe me," she said in a dull voice, "I was dreading it. I know you must hate me. I know how much I've hurt you." My anger was building up, but I tried to restrain it. "I don't think so, Lori. I don't think you even realize what you've done to Emily and to me." Forget the pain of being abandoned by Emily's wife and mother. Forget the humiliation of being left for another man. Forget about the fact that you left without saying a word, without explaining yourself, or even saying goodbye. Your disappearance made me the subject of a police investigation. They searched our house and impounded my car looking for bloodstains. Thanks to you, my reputation was tarnished. Our friends abandoned me, and I almost lost my job at the university. I received hate calls and letters because complete strangers thought I killed you and hid your body. There are people who are ready to lynch me if this case had gone on long enough. I shouted, taking a breath and lowering the volume. So no, I don't think you have any idea how badly you hurt me. As I spoke, her face went pale and she hung her head, unable to resist my anger. When I finished, she looked up and I saw tears streaming down her cheeks. She pulled a tissue out of her purse, wiped her eyes, and said in a low voice, "I'm so sorry, John. I had no idea about all of this. I'm so sorry." "I'm afraid sorry is not the right word," I said sharply. At that moment, I should have sent her away, but after so many months of reflection, I couldn't help but ask, "Why did you do it? What made you leave Emily and me?" "I didn't mean to do it," she whimpered. We started with some light flirting, and the next thing I knew I was falling for him and having a full-blown affair. I felt so young. I didn't mean for it to happen, it just did. "Oh yes," I said dismissively. "That's good old Lori. Choppy and carefree, stubborn and incredibly selfish. So selfish that she was willing to abandon her husband of 20 years, not to mention giving up her own daughter to continue her little affair." "No, you're wrong," she sobbed. "I hated hurting you, and it killed me to want to leave Emily, but I just couldn't look her in the eye, not after what I did." I'd suspected who her lover was before, but now I was sure. "So you seduced Brandon Hilton. You stole your daughter's boyfriend and ran off with him. What a wonderful mother you make." "That's not true," she protested. "I was trying to protect Emily. I made Brandon break up with her. I knew it was a lie as soon as I heard it." "No, you weren't trying to help Emily. You made Brandon break up with Emily to prove you were more desirable than her. No wonder you can't look your daughter in the eye. It's just pathetic." She didn't try to refute my accusations, just covered her face with her hands and sobbed. But I wasn't done with my questions yet. "So after you won the contest with your daughter, you just decided to disappear without a word of explanation, without even packing a suitcase?" "It wasn't like that," she defended herself. "I left work early that day and went to his apartment too. You know. Anyway, when we were done and lying there, he told me he was going out of town in the afternoon. I begged him not to, but he was adamant. He got up to dress, and when I saw the suitcase he had packed, I thought, he is leaving me just like Emily. Then he turned and said, 'So are you coming or not?' I realized he wasn't dumping me. He still wanted me to be with him. I was ecstatic and crazy about him, and anyway, I just got in the car with him and we drove off," she said, shrugging her shoulders as if that explained everything. I knew Lori was impulsive, but this was more than I could have imagined. "You left taking only your clothes with you?" I asked in amazement. Her face reddened with embarrassment. "Well, I had some clothes at Brandon's apartment that I took with me in a gym bag, so I could change if I needed to after, practicing this." That little detail only increased my anger, but I ignored it because I still didn't understand. "What were you doing for money?" "You never wrote checks or used credit cards." "I felt bad enough about leaving you and Emily," she said quickly. "I couldn't take the money you needed to provide for her." By this time, I had already realized how self-serving she was, so I immediately let that explanation pass my ears. "No, that wasn't the reason. You just didn't want any of us to know where you went or who you went with. You decided to go on your own little romantic adventure, and you didn't want me or Emily or anyone else to know what you did." The look on her face told me that I had understood the situation correctly. "But I still don't understand how you did it with no money," I continued. "Brandon has a trust fund," she said. "He has a lot of money." Then her face turned red again. "And I had a bank account you didn't know about in my maiden name." I started pacing around the room, trying to contain my anger. There was still a lot I didn't know, but I didn't care about the answers anymore. Each new revelation from her was like a body blow, even after all this time. Yes, I'd seen impulsiveness and stubbornness in her, but who would have thought they would lead to this? As I passed by the window, I happened to look outside and saw an unfamiliar car parked outside the house. That's probably where he's waiting for you, I muttered. She looked up with a strange expression on her face. No, that's Jackie. She drove me here. Oh? Where's your lover? He left me, she said through her tears. One day he told me he had a new opportunity, and I wasn't part of it. Then he left, and I was alone in New York. I tried to make it on my own, but it was too hard for me. So he dumped you the same way you dumped me, I said vindictively. I guess it's true what they say. Karma's a bitch. I guess it is, she said quietly. Then she stood up, walked to the window, and gestured for Jackie to come over. Turning to me, she spoke more emphatically. I know I was stubborn and impetuous and all that other stuff you called me. Yes, I left you, and now I regret it with all my heart. And most of all, I regret leaving Emily. But you must understand, I had no choice. Of course, I said wryly. What mother would want to tell her daughter that she stole her boyfriend? That was only part of the case, she said quietly. Before I could answer, Jackie walked through the front door. She had a baby in her arms, and I was confused for a moment. But when Lori came over and took the baby from her, all I could do was exclaim, "Oh my God!" Lori looked at me sadly. Now you see why I couldn't look at both of you. She must have known what I was about to ask because she continued. When I left, I forgot my birth control pills and had trouble getting a new prescription. Brandon wouldn't use condoms, and I figured it couldn't hurt, but... Her voice broke. So did he dump you before or after you gave birth? I asked grudgingly. Before she could answer, I heard the sounds of Emily returning from her parenting class. Walking into the kitchen from the garage, she called out, "Hey, Daddy, whose car is that out front?" Then she walked into the living room carrying baby Bridget in her arms and stopped when she saw her mother. I know I could have done better, should have thought of something to say to gently bring her up to speed. But I was so angry at what Lori had done and so stunned by the horror of the situation that I turned to my daughter and exclaimed, "Look who your mom brought with her, your new stepsister." Then, seeing Lori looking at Emily's baby, I said, "Lori, meet baby Bridget, your new granddaughter." It took them a moment to realize what I had just said, but then they both started crying. Of course, the baby started crying too, and even Jackie started sobbing. I felt like crying too, but most of all, I felt exhausted. I didn't have the energy to play judge between Emily and her mother. No matter what Emily had to say, I felt like her mother would get what she deserved. Finally, I just left the room, walked to the hallway, and collapsed on the couch. From the other room, angry words came to me, accompanied by a few anguished cries. I guessed that they had just realized that both children shared a father. There was still a lot of crying on the part of both mother and babies. But after a while, I realized that the living room had become quiet, and I began to guess what was going on. I hesitated, but when I finally poked my head through the door, I saw Jackie holding baby Lori, Lori holding baby Bridget, and Emily peering out from behind her shoulder. Noticing me, Emily gestured for me to come back into the room and walked over to me. I had no idea what to say to my daughter. Lori's revelation stunned me. I couldn't imagine the effect they must have had on Emily. Her own mother had stolen her boyfriend and then had a child with him. How could I alleviate Emily's suffering? But before I could say anything, Emily stunned me. "Daddy, can Mom stay with the baby at our house for a while?" "You've got to be kidding me." I gasped in shock. "After everything she's done to you and me?" "I know, Daddy, and I don't know if I can ever forgive her for it." "But she's broke, Daddy, and she has nowhere else to go. Her baby needs somewhere to live, at least until Mommy gets back on her feet. Please, Daddy. After all, her baby is Bridget's half-sister and mine." I shuddered at the realization of that. "Why can't she live with Jackie?" I protested. Emily looked at me with annoyance. "Jackie lives in a one-bedroom apartment, Dad." "Well, then Lori can go live with her parents." "She's their responsibility?" I tried. "Yeah, sure, Daddy." "As if," Emily replied wryly. We tried to shield Emily from the acrimony of our relationship with the Carltons, but of course she picked up on the discord early on. We both knew that was not an option. I learned 2 lessons that day. The first was that I would never understand mother-daughter relationships. I half expected that when Emily found out about her mother's betrayal, a fight would break out. That Emily offered Lori a safe haven, even if only temporary, was beyond my imagination. The second lesson I'd learned was that it's nearly impossible for a father to refuse his daughter when she really wants something. I made advance plans to meet Bridget the next evening. It was the one time I didn't want to see her. My misgivings must have been obvious, because when Bridget opened the door and saw me, she immediately asked, "What's wrong, John?" "What's wrong?" I knew that procrastination would get me nowhere, so I led her over to the couch and sat down next to her. "Bridget, there's something I have to tell you." "Lori's back." A look of surprise flashed across her face, which was almost immediately replaced by pain. She took a breath, then nodded slightly in understanding. "And you and her decided to get back together?" "No, no." I almost shouted. "That's not what this is about at all." I continued to explain what had happened and how Emily had insisted that I temporarily help her mother and child. Bridget's face relaxed a little, but there was still pain in her eyes as she looked at me. "Don't scare me like that again, John. I've already lost one man I love. I don't think I can bear to lose another." Did she just say she loved me? I felt closer and closer to Bridget the more we saw each other, but I wasn't sure how she felt about me. Now, hearing those words, my fears and hesitations seemed to melt away. I put my arms around her and looked into her eyes. I, too, have lost a spouse, but I have found another, a better one that I can love. I promise, if you need me, you won't lose me. She didn't say anything back, but I thought I felt something stirring in her, too. It just so happened that we got down to it. I felt like my long nightmare was over, too. Now our lives were in a new, unfamiliar direction. Bridget and I began to spend every opportunity we could together, but we decided to continue living apart, at least for now. First, we didn't want to rush things. And second, our house was still bustling with two moms taking care of two babies, plus a nanny Bridget had found who now came every weekday to help. She was a godsend because she allowed Emily to continue attending classes and Lori to start looking for a job to support herself and her baby. I still tried to help, but truth be told, I was in the minority. This had an unfortunate side effect. When I had more free time, I began to reflect on everything that had happened to me. It may seem contradictory, but the happier I felt with Bridget, the unhappier I became with Lori. Emily had found a way to coexist with her mother through the shared experience of caring for their infants. But I had nothing to assuage the bitterness of my ex-wife's betrayal and the resentment that she had hurt me by not only deceiving me, but by disappearing in such a way as to cast suspicion on me. Over time, however, I found that the focus of my resentment shifted to one person who had so far avoided consequences: Brandon Hilton. It was he who had seduced my wife. It was he who had defiled my daughter, and it was he who had sullied my name, perhaps irreparably. Even more unpleasant was the fact that seduction was no longer recognized as a crime. Apparently, society was perfectly willing to allow predators like Hilton to seduce wives and daughters, and then look the other way when they walked away abruptly. Shouldn't there be some kind of punishment for all the pain and suffering they left behind? I went back and reread the Oxbow incident. This time I had more sympathy for the members of the posse who had tracked down the rustlers. Yes, they hung the wrong people, but they were forced to act by an ineffective justice system that couldn't protect them. Moreover, I reminded myself, the crimes these men were trying to commit were not minor. Deprive a rancher of his herd, and he might not be able to feed his family when the winter snows howled across the prairie. Steal a man's horse, and you almost certainly condemn him to a slow, lingering death of starvation and dehydration far from human civilization. No wonder the vigilantes took up arms against the Sea of Troubles to pursue those they felt had wronged them. I understood that Brandon Hilton did not put my family at risk of starvation or leave me to wander on foot in the desert in search of a watering hole. But he has done real, tangible harm to me and my family. He tarnished my reputation, turned me into a hapless cuckold, and left behind two abandoned women. As time went on, I began to spend more and more of my free time searching for his whereabouts, not to mention sleepless nights pondering suitable forms of revenge for what he had done. Most college professors are not well paid, especially liberal arts professors. The loss of Lori's salary had cut our family budget significantly, and now I had several more mouths to feed, as well as hiring a nanny to care for the infants. There was no way I could afford to hire a detective agency to track down my enemy, so I resorted to the poor man's alternative, the internet. Brandon had a Facebook account naturally, but it hadn't been updated in over a year. Besides, I thought he was unlikely to friend me so I could keep track of his activities. A Google search turned up his name on a list of law students, but there was little additional information. Upon discovering this, however, I went to the admissions office to see what I could find in their records. The friendly administrative assistant let me look through his file. Officially, she was not supposed to. But the only thing I learned was that he was also from Savannah. This discovery made me shudder. Could Lori have known him back in the day? But I was quickly convinced of the absurdity of that idea. She must have left for college when he was only a few years old. Realizing this fact made me curse Lori again for her foolish refusal to conform to his age. As my search continued, I found myself becoming something of an expert on the unusual behavior of a certain daughter of a hotel chain magnate with the same last name. But I had no luck finding Brandon Hilton. He seemed to have already escaped from the group that had caught up with him. The futility of my search only strengthened my resolve to find him. Some part of me watched my actions in amazement. What did I think I would do if I found this man? Fight him? I was neither a black belt in martial arts nor an expert in unarmed combat. Plus, he was 20 years younger than me and would probably kick my ass. How did I expect to get satisfaction from him if I could even find him? But those musings did nothing to assuage my anger. He had attacked my family, stolen my wife, and destroyed our home. He dishonored me and tarnished my reputation, insults that were unbearable to me. In earlier times, I knew the answer would have been simple. In the 19th century, when honor was involved, the offended party would challenge the other to a duel with swords or pistols. But I knew from my research that the military was largely responsible for stopping duels. Soldiers and sailors were having so many duels that the military declared it a crime. They needed soldiers on the battlefield. By the 20th century, duels had become a dead tradition. I knew the history and the reasons why society was so strongly opposed to all such extra-legal activities. But the same thought never left me. How could a man restore his honor without taking the law into his own hands, without becoming an avenger? So I continued my obsessive, solitary search for the man I hated, though I never met him face to face, though I had no plan to deal with him, even if I could find him. But none of that stopped me from sneaking over to my computer every few days to see if any new information had come up. By the time spring came around, I had pretty much given up hope of ever finding out Brandon Hilton's whereabouts. I was ready to accept the fact that he was gone and that I would never see him or hear from him again. So one evening I was stunned when one of my search queries yielded a post from the Savannah Morning News. When I read the article, I was stunned. I immediately called Bridget to see if I could come and talk about my discovery. I couldn't discuss it with Emily because I didn't want to upset her, and I didn't want to share the news with Lori, but I couldn't keep it to myself. I found him, I said excitedly, handing the newsprint out to Bridget. You won't believe what he just did. She quickly scanned the article and handed it back to me. I don't understand, John. I know you hate Brandon, but what does his getting married have to do with you? I couldn't understand why Bridget wasn't shocked by this news, but then I realized that there was no way she could realize its significance. Bridget, Lori's maiden name was Carlton, I called out. That bastard is engaged to Cecily Carlton, Lori's sister and Aunt Emily's sister. Unbelievable, she gasped. Why won't he leave the Carlton family alone? It's as if he's taking revenge on the Carlton women. I had not thought of it in that way and tried to reason. No, I said slowly, I don't think that's the case. But as far as he knew, it was Lori and Emily Manning. I doubt if he knows Lori's maiden name, he's probably not aware that he and Cecily are related. Maybe not, she admitted, but I still don't see how the Carltons could let Cecily get engaged to him after what he did to Emily and Lori. That's the thing, I said. They don't know either. Since Lori and I got married, there's been virtually no contact between her and her family. I'm sure they know Lori is alive now, but they probably have no idea who she ran off with. Rufus Carlton probably thinks he's gotten a promising young lawyer from Savannah to be his son-in-law. If Brandon doesn't know and the Carltons don't know, Bridget asked, then why do you care what's going on in Savannah? I shook my head. Brandon may not know there's any connection between them, but from what I understand, he's back again. He's like a thief who robs your house and then comes back to rob it again. He owes me, and this time I'm going to do something about it. A concerned expression appeared on Bridget's face. John, what are you thinking? You're not going to do something stupid, are you? Force has never solved anything. I didn't say this to Bridget, but as a historian I knew that this old saying was untrue. You think force never solved anything? Tell that to the Carthaginians after Cato forced the Romans to conquer their army, slaughter all their men, enslave their women, and cover their fields with salt, so nothing would grow on them for 7 years. That pretty well settled the matter for Carthage, I thought. But I didn't want to alarm Bridget, so I only said, I don't know what I'll do, but I can't stand idly by and watch it happen. Now that Brandon Hilton's whereabouts were no longer a mystery, my mood only worsened. The possibility of revenge was no longer a fantasy. Now I was faced with the dilemma of what to do. I had always believed in the law. As a historian, I knew all too well what happens when people take their thirst for revenge into their own hands. But after what happened to me and my family, I just couldn't sit back and let this man go unpunished. My pride, my honor, and my sense of justice demanded an answer. Brandon Hilton had to pay for what he had done. Finally, after a long, sleepless night, I made my decision. Having made it, I found that I could devise a plan to get satisfaction. I didn't have much time, but I figured I could do what needed to be done if I hurried. Now I began to use the internet to research the steps I would have to take and acquire the resources I needed to accomplish my goal. One by one, I found them. During this time, I was often away from home running errands, but I hoped that taking care of the 2 little ones would distract the others enough that they wouldn't notice how busy I was. The last thing I needed was a lot of questions and doubts. But both Emily and Bridget knew how to read my moods, and eventually, just before D-Day, as I called it, they confronted me. I was working at my computer one evening and looked up to see Emily standing on the doorstep of my office with a concerned expression on her face. Hey, babe, I said lightly. How's it going? Bridget's here, she told me. We need to talk to you. This was unusual. I hadn't planned on seeing Bridget tonight. I quickly closed the web browser and started to get up when Bridget walked through the door. She wasn't smiling. Before I could say anything, Emily spoke up. Dad, Bridget told me you found Brandon. I threw Bridget a dirty look, but she just folded her arms across her chest and stared at me with a determined expression. Emily continued, Daddy, I'm scared to death that you're going to do something crazy. I know how upset you are about everything that's happened, and you have every right to be. But if you end up in jail or go and destroy yourself, it will only make things worse. Bridget walked over and put her hand on Emily's shoulder. Please, John, Emily is right. Whatever you're up to, don't do it. I've already lost one person. I won't survive if it happens again. I saw the tears in their eyes, and in that moment I was tempted to forget my plans. These 2 women I loved more than anything in the world, and the last thing I wanted to do was hurt them. But I just couldn't call it off. A line from one of the Cavalier poets ran through my mind. I could not love you, my dear, so much if I did not love you more than honor. I walked around my desk and hugged them both. Thank you for caring about me. It means a lot. But you're both worried about nothing, I tried to reassure them. I'm not going to do anything stupid. You know me better than that. Emily raised hopeful eyes to me. Promise, Daddy? I remembered Emily as a little girl and held out my pinky finger to her. Pinky promise, baby, I vowed, and she took my finger with hers and smiled. But there was a flicker of doubt in Bridget's eyes, and I realized I hadn't fooled her. I guess losing a husband in battle has that effect on a woman. I'd have to be careful not to scare her into trying to stop me. I thought I did a pretty good job of calming Emily down, but my efforts were nearly undone when she picked up a package from the delivery service while I was still at school. When I got home, she held the box out to me with a concerned look on her face. What's this, Daddy? It says on the package that it's from the armory. It's heavy. I knew immediately what it was. I had ordered it a while ago and was worried if it would arrive in time. Nothing special, babe, just a gift for a colleague in the history department, I lied. She didn't say anything else, but I could see the doubt on her face. That evening, I was sitting in my office double-checking the driving directions diagram when Lori startled me by entering the room and closing the door. I'd made it clear that I wasn't happy to have her and her baby in our house, and so far she'd kept her distance. Well, what do you want? I asked coldly. For a while, she just stared at me, then her face turned red and she started to cry. I know I've hurt you, been unfaithful, made you suffer, and... She stopped to suppress a sob. And I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but... She had to pause again before she could continue. Just, please don't hurt yourself or go to jail or anything because of me. I've done enough for you. I just can't bear to be the cause of more pain for you, or Emily, or even Bridget. I sat still. That's your trouble, Lori. You always think it's all about you. But it's not about you, it's about me. I'm doing what I have to do. You're out of my life and you can't get back into it now or in the future. Do you understand? Her face went pale, then she turned and walked swiftly away. After a moment's thought, I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a copy of the wedding announcement in the Savannah Morning News. I folded it and put it in an envelope. Then gathered all the essentials. Tomorrow was D-Day and I wanted to get an early start. Waking up early in the morning, I showered and shaved, grabbed my things and tiptoed into the kitchen to get some breakfast before heading out. I was just finishing my second cup of coffee when Emily walked into the room with the baby in her arms. She immediately noticed my suitcase and looked at me questioningly. "Where are you going, Daddy?" she asked anxiously. "I'll be back late tonight or early tomorrow morning, baby," I told her. "Where are you going?" she asked again, and I could see her anxiety growing. "It's okay, baby, I promise." "It's going to be okay," I told her, kissing both her and the baby on the forehead. Before she could speak, I reached into my pocket and handed her the envelope I had sealed last night. "Do me a favor, babe. When Lori gets home from work this afternoon, please give this to her." There was real fear in her eyes now, but before she could say anything else, the baby started crying, and while she attended to him, I took that opportunity to slip out the door. As I pulled out of the driveway, I wondered if Emily would wait for Lori to return before reading the announcement. That made me wonder, and I reached into my pocket and turned off my cell phone. I didn't feel like talking to anyone until I did what I had to do. It's about a 4-hour drive from Atlanta to Savannah, so I reached the city a little after noon. After eating a fast food lunch, I stopped at a cheap motel to rest and change. After all, I wanted to look good for the wedding. It was still spring, but it was already hot and humid in Savannah. There was a breeze blowing in from the ocean, of course, but it did little to lower the temperature. I wore the dark wool suit I'd brought with me. It was unremarkable, but acceptable for a wedding. That was fine with me. I didn't want to be noticed, at least not right now. The air conditioning in the car kept me comfortable during the drive to the cathedral, but as soon as I parked and started walking to the cathedral entrance, I started to sweat. I checked to make sure my jacket was buttoned. The wedding was invitation only, but no one ever checks the guest list. I waited for a group of guests to walk up the steps and join them. I even made idle conversation with one couple while we waited for the stewards to escort the ladies to the pews. When asked, I said I wanted to sit on the bride's side, not because I didn't care about the Carlton family, but because there were more people sitting on that side of the aisle. Best disguise, I thought. The cathedral was a beautiful place for a wedding. The high top of the nave was impressive, and the altar was strewn with lilies and white roses. The bride was beautiful in her long white dress as she walked down the aisle under the arm of her father. This old lecher was looking out at the congregation. I made sure to turn away as he passed my pew. The wedding mass was traditional. The priest even asked if anyone present knew of any reasons why a couple in love shouldn't get married. I was tempted to speak up, but held back. The atmosphere was inappropriate for what I was about to do. After the wedding, the entire congregation went to the country club for the reception. I waited until most of the parking lot was clear and followed, not wanting to stand out in any way. The reception was held in the club's main dining room. Rectangular tables were arranged in rows along one wall, forming an elongated main table. The rest of the room was filled with round tables, each large enough to seat 8 people. The tables were arranged in a semicircle to leave an open area for dancing. I estimated that there were 60 tables in the room. I'd have a good audience for the performance. I found an unoccupied table at the back of the room and sat down. Must be employees or distant relatives, I thought. The other exiles at the table were glad for the company, and we struck up a leisurely conversation about the wedding, the reception, and how much Rufus must have spent. It must have cost him a fortune, one woman told me breathlessly. He hired Paula Dean to organize the whole thing. I believed her. The food was delicious. If this was going to be my last dinner, I thought, at least it would be enjoyable. After dinner, the wine glasses were removed and replaced with champagne flutes. I knew what this portended, and my stomach tensed. At dinner, I drank wine only a sip at a time because I wanted to have a steady hand. But I did accept the champagne flute, not to drink, but as a prop to help prepare my performance. The sound of Rufus Carlton's meaty finger tapping on the microphone drew our collective attention to the main table. After a few exuberant words about his daughter and her new husband, Rufus opened the microphone for toasts. A procession of friends and relatives followed, each of whom felt it their duty to share some mildly humorous anecdote about the bride or groom. Each toast was followed by laughter, applause, and more alcohol. As the ritual dragged on, I stood up and moved across the room toward the main table. After a few more offerings, things began to quiet down, and the best man, as I had hoped, asked, "Anyone else who wants some?" I raised my glass and exclaimed in a loud voice, "I have a toast." Since I was standing off to the side, it was hard for most of those seated at the head table to see me. I didn't think there would be many people in the audience who might recognize me, but I didn't want to take any chances. As I climbed up on the platform behind the honored guests at the head table, I saw that most of the audience wasn't paying any attention to me. That's going to change, I thought grimly. I took the microphone and cleared my throat loudly. I wanted to get people's attention, but my throat was suddenly dry anyway. It was time to get started. We've heard a lot of anecdotes about the past today, but I want to talk about the future of Mr. and Mrs. Hilton, I said in a falsely cheerful tone. And by future, I mean children, of course. This elicited laughter and a few cheers from the crowd. I predict that this couple will have many children in the future, I continued. I can't speak for Cecily, but I can definitely vouch for Brandon's abilities in that area. There were a few more chuckles, but a slight murmur went up in the audience, and I noticed a few people looking at each other questioningly. I spoke a little louder. I can say that with certainty because Brandon has already fathered at least 2 children that I know of. I heard Mrs. Carlton sigh, and immediately the audience murmured. Rufus Carlton turned to look at me point blank, and suddenly recognition dawned on his face. "You are John Manning. You weren't invited to the wedding. Get off the stage." Brandon was sitting next to the platform in a mildly intoxicated state, but when he heard my name, something apparently caught his eye and he started to rise. I quickly leaned over, put my hand on his shoulder, and roughly pushed him back into his seat. Some hustling soul had turned off the microphone, but it didn't faze me. I'd taught freshman history to a class of 300 people in an auditorium, so I knew how to project my voice. "I have something to say," I said loudly. Rufus yelled again for someone to get me off the stage. To my right, a few young men, must be Brandon's friends, were trying to make their way through the tables to do just that. I was ready for it. I reached down, unbuttoned my jacket, and pulled my left side open to reveal the shoulder holster I was wearing. With my right hand, I pulled out a .357 Magnum with an 8-inch barrel and waved it toward the advancing men. Shouts erupted from the hall and the men hastily retreated. "Mr. Magnum and I want to say a few more words to you about Brandon Hilton," I said loudly, keeping my left hand on his shoulder. He looked up at me, and his eyes were as wide and white as the wedding cookies we were served for dessert. "Like I said, Brandon Hilton is already the father of at least 2 children," I continued. "Would you like to know from whom?" Turning to Rufus, I growled, "The first child was by your second daughter, Lori, and the second was by your granddaughter, Emily." I heard the bride scream and turned to her sternly. "That's right, Cecily," I shouted. "Brandon is the father not only of your sister's child, but also of your niece." The poor girl broke into sobs. I felt a little sorry for her, because this girl had never been unkind to me, but I couldn't say the same for the rest of her family. I turned to Brandon again. "You've always screwed around with whoever you wanted, someone else's wife. And you've always gotten away with it, haven't you, Brandon? But not now!" With those words, I reached up, grabbed Brandon by his curly blonde hair, and yanked him back. Simultaneously, I put the Magnum on the podium, reached into the sheath under my jacket on my right side, and pulled out my Bowie knife. I wanted to make an impression, and a huge knife with a blade as long as the barrel of the Magnum certainly succeeded. When he saw the Bowie knife in my hands, he instinctively raised his hand in an attempt to protect his face. This gave me the opportunity to take his hair. I pulled out a plastic bag and put a hair sample in it. "This should be enough for a DNA test," I told him, and the others gathered. Realizing that I wasn't going to destroy it, the young man slumped down in his seat. Looking down, I saw a dark stain spreading across the crotch of his pants. But I wasn't done with him yet. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a stack of papers, and shoved them into his hands. "Brandon Hilton, this is a legal notice that you are being sued to establish paternity for the child you fathered with Lori Carlton Manning. You are hereby subpoenaed." I reached into my jacket again and pulled out a second packet. "Brandon Hilton, this is a legal notice of the filing of a paternity suit regarding the child you are fathering with Emily Manning. You are being served." I looked at him in disgust. "Don't even think about trying to disappear again." I've already notified the Georgia Department of Child Welfare. They have their own thing about deadbeat dads, and as soon as the court formalizes the case, they'll swoop in to collect on you wherever you go. I jerked his head up again. You want to predict your future, Brandon? I predict that for the next 18 years or so, you're going to do very little except work to pay child support for your kids. With those words, I climbed up the desk to the main floor. But before I left, I turned to the old man. He was looking at me with a mixture of hatred and despair. Congratulations on your new son-in-law, Rufus, I told him with a chuckle. You certainly are an excellent judge of character. There was a primal scream of some sort behind me, and I looked over my shoulder just in time to see Brandon grab the massive pistol I'd left on the podium. He raised it, took aim at me, and began frantically pulling the trigger. I shook my head. Don't try to shoot me in the back, Brandon. That's not a real gun, it's a replica of one. Then I laughed. Why don't you keep it? Consider it my wedding present. With those words, I headed for the door as the commotion behind me reached hysterical levels. People in the hall were yelling at each other. Cecily and her mother were sobbing in each other's arms, and Rufus was yelling at Brandon. At that moment, in a strange but surprisingly appropriate decision, the band leader raised his wand and ordered the musicians to play. I smiled as I walked out the door. Too bad they didn't play Nearer My God to Thee, I thought to myself. That would have been the perfect ending to this shipwreck. In all the commotion, no one followed me. Or maybe it was just the memory of Bowie's knife still dangling from my belt. Whatever the case, I managed to get to my car and drive away without further incident. As I pulled onto the freeway heading north, the adrenaline started to wear off and I started to shake. Then a tremendous fatigue came over me. I thought about pulling over and getting some sleep, but it was more important for me to get home. I certainly didn't want to get arrested anywhere near Savannah. I rolled down the car windows to let the cool night air blow over my face and keep me awake. As I drove, I thought about what I had decided to do. If I destroyed Brandon Hilton, I would end up in prison, leaving my family destitute. Furthermore, I would have deprived the two little ones of the child support that Hilton would soon have to start paying. I guess in a way I became a vigilante of sorts, but I did it in my own way within the law. I took a certain amount of satisfaction from Brandon Hilton. I made sure he paid for what he had done and would continue to pay until both of those kids were adults. My daughter could definitely use the money to raise little Bridget, and with any luck, the extra income would help get Lori out of my house sooner. As a bonus, I'd also managed to get revenge on Rufus Carlton, and if my little stunt had caused him to spend a lot of money on a fancy wedding, that was just gravy, I thought. No matter what happened, I felt good, like a heavy weight had been lifted off my back. It was well past midnight when I finally made it to our neighborhood in Atlanta. I was going to be very quiet so as not to wake anyone up, but when I pulled into the driveway, the lights on the main floor were already on. As I started up the driveway, the door opened and Bridget, Emily, and even Lori came running out of it with tears in their eyes. Emily was the first to reach me and fell into my arms, sobbing. "Oh, Daddy, I was so scared." Bridget then caught up to me. "Don't you ever do anything so crazy again, John Manning. What if they had attacked you? What if someone had brought a gun?" I took them both under my arms and led them back into the house. Both women wouldn't let go of me, and all three of us collapsed on the couch in exhaustion. When Bridget felt the sheath resting against her side, she made me pull out the Bowie knife and show it to her along with the bag full of Brandon's hair. "I can't believe you took that thing with you," she exclaimed. Then she looked at me perplexed. "You know that hair wouldn't count as hard evidence, right?" she asked. "I know," I answered. "The court will order him to provide a new sample for trial. But getting this one was a lot of fun, and it certainly convinced everyone here that I was right. Besides, it scared Brandon to death literally. And then a thought hit me. How do you all know what happened there?" "I told them," Lori said quietly. "Cecily called me and told me what happened." "Cecily called you?" "You haven't talked to her in years," I said incredulously. "I know," Lori said, "but she had to call me to find out if what you said about Brandon was really true. When I told her everything that had happened, she said she was going to start seeking an annulment tomorrow." I nodded. I was glad to hear that news. Tears were still streaming down Lori's face. "I know you didn't do it for me, John, but thank you for saving Cecily from that monster. It's going to be really hard on her for a while, but at least she knows the truth now instead of later. Thank you for saving my little sister." I nodded again. I had done what I had done, for my own reasons, but I was still relieved to know that Cecily's life wouldn't be ruined by that immoral bastard. Despite my misgivings, the police never showed up at our house that night or the next day. I thought Rufus would come after me, but apparently he directed his anger at Brandon instead. That young man's life was going downhill fast. Just as she had told Lori, Cecily had gotten her wedding annulled, arguing that Brandon had withheld important information from her. Meanwhile, at the trial of the 2 paternity suits I filed, the court ruled that he was indeed the father of Lori and Emily's children and awarded both women appropriate child support. With his vital statistics registered with the Georgia Division of Child Support Services, Brandon Hilton became a marked man. The wedding reception was the sensation of the year, and although the guest list numbered only 500, thousands of Savannah residents claimed to have witnessed the fiasco. Not surprisingly, Brandon left town shortly afterward. I heard that he now holds a lowly position in Macon city government. What really surprised me was that Rufus Carlton apparently helped him get the job. I guess Rufus decided that the fact that Brandon had a job was in the best interest of all concerned. Of course, after paying 2 child support payments each month, Brandon doesn't have much spare cash left. Cecily and Lori kept in touch with each other, and eventually Lori moved back to Savannah. I think without me, Rufus was ready to welcome her back into the family. Or maybe he realized that banishing his daughter wasn't such a wise decision. Either way, her leaving was a relief to me. After everything that had happened, I wish I could say I forgave her, but that would be a lie, and I was glad she was out of my life. Emily is still living at home, but wants to find her own place soon. She has found a good job here in Atlanta and is taking classes in the evenings to get her college degree. She has also recovered enough to start rebuilding a social life. Being a single mom isn't easy, but Bridget and I enjoy babysitting, and that helps. Yes, Bridget and I were married in a small private ceremony. She told me after my vigilante adventure that she wasn't going to let me out of her sight, so I decided to accept the inevitable and make it legal. Now that my personal Avengers excursion is over, I've decided to write a book on the subject. Hopefully, my future interactions with those who want to take the law into their own hands will only be academic in nature. However, it seems there is still one potential vigilante left in my life. My new wife took the Bowie knife, framed it, and hung it above our fireplace. She explicitly warned me that if I pulled such a damn stupid stunt like that again, she would take it down and perform an operation I would never forget. I think she's joking, but I don't intend to risk finding out.